I'm Megan, your host of the book club, and I'm here with Dr. Prizant, who is the author of the fantastic book we're reading, Uniquely Human. And I cannot tell you how much I'm loving the book.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Loving. So we have some questions from the group, and I thought that I might just start with those while I work on my nerves a little bit. Michaela is one of our group members. She just published her first book. She's an autistic author.
Mm-hmm.
And she just published her first book. And she was asking, what inspired you to write Uniquely Human?
First, Michaela, congratulations on publishing your book. That's very exciting.
Yes.
What inspired me? Specifically, what inspired me was that for many, many years as a speech and language pathologist, I would come home and speak to my wife and my son and tell them stories about the amazing kids I was meeting and what I was learning from them. And my wife, who is a psychologist, by the way, she always said that she learned a lot from my stories because autism was not an area that she focused on in her work. And so over the years, I would write those stories down and then eventually set up files. And after a number of years, she had said to me over a number of years, you need to write a book of just stories. And finally, I pulled it together and wrote the book. And I must give credit to Tom Fields Meyer, who actually helped me make the book a little bit more accessible. What I mean by that is I was trained as an academic writer. And even though I didn't write only academically, he, as a writer, looked at what I was writing and made suggestions and rewrote some sections. Now, the other thing about Tom, besides being a professional writer, is he is the father of a now 25-year-old son on the spectrum.
Oh, wow.
So I had the perspective of a parent, and his son is named Ezra, just amazing. He actually wrote a book about his son called Following Ezra. And I love that book. So
we'll have to add it to our list of suggestions.
Yes. Yeah, you should. And so that's the story of how the book came to be.
Wow. Yeah. Because academic writing, that's a lot different than what you wrote. I mean, you wrote a very accessible, easy to read, easy to follow book.
Yes. And that was my intention.
You just kept a journal all over all the years of stories and just things that you learned, and it came into fruition with this book.
Yes. Yeah, that's what it is. And I still remain very, very involved in a lot of different ways, consulting to schools. I'm on the board, the advisory board, and actually the board of directors now of 2 theater groups for children and adults with autism.
Oh, wow.
Or on the spectrum. So I have so many more stories, and I'm kind of gathering stories for a follow-up right now. Yeah.
Actually, that was one question I was going to ask you is what projects are you working on next? Do you have a new book coming out or?
Oh, so many projects. I don't have a new book coming out per se, but I'm preparing, and hopefully that'll be coming out somewhere down the line. The amazing thing is that Uniquely Human has become so popular. It's been a bestseller for 4.5 years since it's been out on Amazon. And I'm invited to give a lot of keynote addresses. I just returned from Spain and Switzerland. So in a way, the success of Uniquely Human and the fact that so many people have embraced it has taken up a lot of my time.
Right.
Moving forward.
It's such a huge book. I mean, it's what people, I had an IEP meeting the other day with for one of my kids, and I brought the book with me. And I told the principal, I told the teacher, I told the speech pathologist, I told the compliance officer who's there at all my meetings. And I said, you have to get this book. You have to put it on your list. If you can't buy it, I'll buy it for you. Because just in the first chapter, the introduction in the first chapter, I just got chills in my body because you were talking about my kid on the floor. You were talking about my kid not wanting to go somewhere, and then there's a reason why he doesn't want to go there. And it just brought me back to last year's school, like last school year, and just everything you say, it just gives me Yes, yes, everybody needs to read this.
And that's what has happened. And I mean, it's a wonderful occurrence that so many people have embraced it. But what I didn't expect was that it would be embraced by such a wide variety of people. I mean, I get notes and letters, and if you look on the Amazon page for the book, there are over 300 comments now from autistic adults, from parents of newly diagnosed kids. I get notes from parents of adult children on the spectrum who say, thank you, because now when I read back, I think back, I see that we did so many things right for my son or my daughter. Professionals, therapists of all kinds. It's been really amazing how it's resonated with so many people, and I'm very grateful for that.
I love that I can't remember the word that you used because I'm not in that world, but you were an I mean, you trained as an SLP, like a physio. I forget what you said in the book.
Well, I'm a speech language pathologist.
You're right, but it was something, but anyway, yeah. So I told.
I think I know what you're referring to. My undergraduate degree is in psycholinguistics.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I couldn't remember what it was.
And psycholinguistics at the time that I was in school in the late 60s, early 70s, was a brand new field that looked at the relationship between thought and language, that looked at how complex communication is and how communication and language is connected to social development and emotional development. And autism, the field of autism, wasn't looking at those things at that time. So I actually did my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation on autism in the 1970s.
So you were a trailblazer back then.
Well, I was a trailblazer because I had worked at summer camps from the time I was 17, and a trailblazer because I was learning from the children and the people who I was working with at these residential summer camps. I mean, huge influence from the get-go, and I was hooked.
That brings me to a question that Louisa posted earlier, and I wonder about this too, just because back in those days, I mean, we read our first book in the book club was Neurotribes. So we read a lot about the history and what was going on and the attitudes. So Louisa said, your approach to working with autistic people seems so common sensible, like obvious things parents and educators should be doing. Why do you think more professionals aren't adopting these approaches? And what do you think the resistance is? In general, she's thinking in general, but also organizations going out of their way to do the opposite, like the current issue with the ASHA, which is the American.
My association, the American Speech Language Hearing.
There you go. And them wanting to make ABA a part of that.
Yes.
So why do you, like, what made you look at these children and the people that you work with differently than the people who were in charge of the field back then?
Yeah, this is a part of the story of my career back then as well as now. So where do I start? I think the reason that I think I looked at things differently was those summer camp experiences long before I went and got my academic degrees. So I knew what it was like to be responsible for the care, the health, and the happiness of children who I lived with for 2 months every summer for 6 years. So that was number one.
So you met them before you learned about them.
Oh, absolutely.
In academics. So that helped even further. Yeah.
That, and when I started working, I became very involved with parent associations. So I got to know the parents extremely well as friends, and I got to know their experience, not by reading about it in a textbook, but by seeing what they were going through. As a matter of fact, next year is our 25th anniversary of a weekend parent retreat that we do that I discuss in Uniquely Human.
I saw that.
Yeah, and that's an amazing experience. So let me go back in time. At the time that I started, what really dominated the field in the United States was what is now called applied behavior analysis. Back then it was called behavior modification, operant conditioning, learning theory, many different ways to approach that. They're not the same, but very much out of that school of thought. And if you look at the very first article, actually the second article I published in 1982, I challenged a lot of what was going on in ABA at that time. And I challenged the founder, Ivar Lovaas, well, because he was saying things such as, you need to punish kids who use echolalia. And that's also covered in my book. And I said, no, I just studied echolalia for my dissertation and found it's how these kids are trying to connect and communicate. And it serves many different purposes. So very early on in my career, I found myself at odds with what a lot of applied behavior analysts were saying at that time. And I still do. And so we have an educational model called the CERTS model, which CERTS stands for social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional support. So I'm still doing workshops on CERTS internationally. And that is being embraced by a lot of self-advocate groups. So the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network really sees CERTS as being respectful. It's an evidence-based model. There's quite a bit of research behind it. And so you might say, well, how come that hasn't come to dominate? And I'll be quite honest. I think applied behavior analysis has been the most commercially driven education and treatment approach that we've ever seen for any people with any kinds of labeled disabilities, including
big money.
Yeah.
Big money.
Yeah. Oh, incredible.
So how are you going to change that all by yourself?
Well, it's an interesting, I've been involved in the discussion about ASHA. And let me just clarify, we don't know what the guidelines say that are being developed by a committee that talks about a special ASHA certification for working with autistic individuals. But from a session at the ASHA convention recently, and from what we hear, it seems like it's going to lean heavily towards applied behavior analysis. And there are many, many speech language pathologists who don't agree with that. So that's why there's so much turmoil right now that tends to be going on. It's kind of like, wait a second, you're not listening to you're not listening to autistic people and their experiences with applied behavior analysis. You're not giving credence to other approaches, such as the CERTS model, such as floor time. There are many other approaches that are evidence-based out there.
There are. And
the fear is that they're being ignored in these new guidelines. But to be fair, they're supposed to be posted publicly. I believe I heard December 15th.
Let me write that down.
Yeah. So let's see what happens. But right now, they're online. There's actually a petition with almost 5,000 signatures.
Well, I already signed that one.
Yep. So I don't want this to be a Hatfields and McCoys kind of, we're totally right, they're totally wrong. Let's see what they say. But the committee definitely is, the people on the committee are applied behavior analysts and have published in that area. I'm not saying they haven't done some good work. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is there needs to be a much more democratic process representing all approaches and not just one approach primarily.
And so is your CERTS model being used in public schools right now, or is what's happening with that? Because I've never even heard about it before I read your book.
Well, partially you haven't heard about it because we have not pushed it commercially. I mean, we could take out ads in magazines and say, oh, use this model, and it's an evidence-based model. Let me say this, it's being used in more than 12 countries right now. There are private schools and public schools in the United States that have adopted CERTS. Right now, as we speak, I'm consulting to the New York City public schools because they are looking at CERTS very seriously for their citywide autism programs. So CERTS is a process. It's a model that's very comprehensive, all the way from newly diagnosed children up to adult individuals. A lot of what is going on in the field, in a sense, CERTS preceded a lot of what is now considered to be, essential practice in the field. So let me give you one example. Okay. One of the hottest areas right now is emotional regulation in the field of autism. So people want to know, now that we understand how sensory issues affect people on the spectrum, how anxiety affects people on the spectrum, and so forth. So the focus it's one of the hottest areas of research in autism right now. And people are beginning to move away from what we call, and what the field is called behavior management approaches. It's not about managing behavior.
Right.
It's about helping people on the spectrum to develop the strategies to cope with the challenges that they face. And there are many in terms of being well regulated emotionally. Well, we began writing about that in the 1990s, and then we integrated that into the CERTS model in the early 2000s. And now it's just becoming one of the last few years, one of the hottest areas of research.
So most of our, well, I wouldn't say most, we have a lot of different people in the book club, but how would a parent such as myself, I'm just a parent, I don't work in the school systems, how would a parent suggest to their school district that no, we want to back away from the BCBAs in our schools, we want to back away from ABA in our schools, and we want you to consider the CERTS model? How would we do that?
You would speak to the people who are responsible for the trainings in the schools. I mean, one of the things that's happened is due to funding issues, a lot of school districts now bring in people to do workshops rather than sending their staff out to workshops. So both myself and my collaborators, Amy Laurent, Emily Rubin, we do trainings around the country and we do trainings around the world. I don't do this, but Emily and Amy also do follow-ups through Skype after they do a training in terms of working with teams. It's a team-based model. And we believe that it works best when you have occupational therapists working with speech language pathologists, working with educators, parents, an essential component. We're a very family-centered model.
A team, right.
Absolutely. But let me say that sometimes agencies or school districts say they're family-centered and they include parents on the team, but sometimes it's just lip service. Okay. We believe it really has to be cooperative, hand in hand. When CERTS, the phrase I like to use is when CERTS is running on all cylinders, parents have direct input into the goals, not just checking off and saying, I'll sign the IEP, but they have direct input into the goals and the strategies that are being used. It truly is a collaborative process.
And district by district, I think that right there varies so widely. I know in Virginia, parents have a lot more rights over the IEPs and than some other states. And then district by district, it just depends. So
absolutely,
there are other states where parents really don't have any rights, and they barely follow the idea. You know, they barely follow the national laws. So
yeah, and let me just share this with you because my wife, her expertise, she's a clinical psychologist and a nurse, and her expertise is teaching critical care professionals in medicine on how to communicate with families and how to support families. I'm only mentioning that is because we do workshops on communicating with and collaborating with families. She and I do them together.
Oh, cool.
But when I go out and speak to special ed directors, superintendents of schools, and administrators, they say, oh, that sounds wonderful. But they're not interested in that. All they're interested in is bringing people in to train kind of treatment approaches for their teacher. How does a teacher work with the child?
Got to fix it.
And fixed it. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And what we haven't really pushed it, but you know, it's true that most litigation occurs when there is a loss of trust between families and school districts.
Absolutely.
And there are all kinds of skills that SLPs, educators, and even administrators can learn. And that has to do with listening to parents, respecting parents, and collaborating with parents. And if you look at the CERTS manuals, we have 2 manuals with the CERTS model that are huge. It's almost 800 pages of information. We have a whole chapter on working with and collaborating with families. So it's a big part of the CERTS.
Maybe that's where you're going wrong, Dr. Prizant. Yeah. You're going to lose them right there.
Oh, it's just so important.
Yeah.
And not only that, but if it's done right, it enriches the experiences of educators and therapists because they feel like, okay, I find that some educators and therapists are more nervous about working with parents and speaking to parents than they are about working with the kids. And by the way, my wife has found that in her research, that a neurosurgeon is not nervous about doing neurosurgery on a child who's had a severe brain injury What they're nervous about is going to speak to the parents about it because
Right.
they've never been trained to do it. And these skills can be trained.
So the CERTS model, I'm guessing, has its own website that a school
Oh,
district could go to and see what's involved in that.
absolutely. We have it at certs.com, SCERTS.com. But
Okay.
we also have, and if people are interested, you could just shoot an email to me and I could send you 4 pages of resource information about CERTS, including published studies, including free webinars that are online, free 1-hour webinars that relate to the CERTS model. But we also, through a very reputable company called MedBridge, we just put online last year, it's about 10 to 12 hour webinar on the CERTS model by subscription that school districts
Wow.
can subscribe to, agencies can subscribe to. So CERTS.
That's pretty cost effective.
Oh, well, the reason was that people around the world wanted CERTS trainings. One of my colleagues, Amy Laurent, right now is in, let's see, I think she's in England and Italy doing trainings on CERTS.
Wow.
I just returned from Spain, Switzerland, and the Canary Islands. Emily Rubin, I mean, CERTS is taken off like crazy in the UK in terms of it's being taught in the universities and somewhat here as well. But it's interesting that countries that haven't been inundated with information from ABA people are really seeing CERTS as something that's very, very desirable and what they want.
Sensible. Right. Wow. Okay. I think that we could probably talk for hours.
Oh yeah, no
but
doubt.
I won't hold you that long. So let's see. I have a few other questions from our book clubbers. Let's see. Oh, well, I think that you answered this already. Jessica, she's one of our really active book clubbers. She says, have you always had this positive view of autism, or did something happen either specifically or over time to change your view? And I think you did talk about just, I mean, your early on experiences. You didn't have any training that you had to unlearn.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Well, one of the reasons is that my training, when people say, oh, so you're a speech language pathologist. And I say, well, I'm really a developmentalist. My training has been in child and human development, social, emotional, language, communication development. And we built all of that into the CERTS model. And I talk about that in Uniquely Human. But the point is, if you are a researcher and if you are a student of child and human development, it's been such a fascinating, positive field over the last 50 to 75 years. Most applied behavior analysts have no training in typical child and human development. And what I say is, how can you work with children or even adults unless you know about child and human development? It makes no sense.
And if they did learn about child and human development, then they would know that the most crucial part of that is their emotional well-being. I mean, their emotional health is at the center of their development. And if you don't get that taken care of, then nothing else can come of it. I mean, and we're punishing the children, for acting a certain way or behaving a certain way. And then what does that do to their emotional health?
Yes. And let me add a couple of points. First, we know from research, cross-cultural research, that children develop a positive sense of self, self-confidence. They see other people as trustworthy and dependable. Mm-hmm. They see life as just more satisfying based upon one primary factor, and that is called responsive caregiving. That people in their lives are highly responsive to them as human beings. So that if another person sees a child as distressed or upset, they know how to help them soothe and calm in those instances. They know how to support a child developmentally. They know how to help them learn how to play, how to develop friendships. And unfortunately, I mean, some practices in applied behavior analysis, such as planned ignoring, that if a child's upset, we should ignore the child, flies directly in the face of all that we know from child development research. I could go on and on. There are other practices.
I need to get my blood pressure monitor on.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't want to sound like I'm totally anti-ABA.
I understand.
There have been some people who've changed dramatically who are applied behavior analysts, but how have they changed? They've begun to look at the research and literature on child development and on family-centered practice.
Mm.
So they're infusing things that, to tell you the truth, I was a student of from the very, very beginning.
And they should have learned first. They should have learned that first.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, do you know that in some BCBA training programs, there's absolutely no coursework at all on child development?
Yes, I do.
What's wrong in this picture? There's a lot of coursework on how to change behavior, but
Right.
there's no coursework on child development. How can you work with children or work with adults unless you know how human beings develop?
And there's not even a whole lot of training on the history of ABA. I mean, I have a good friend who is a BCBA, and I talk to her about the book club all the time. She's not on Facebook, but when we were reading Neurotribes, and I'll read something and I'll say, "Hey, did you know this?"
Yeah.
And she would say, "No."
Yes.
How do you not know the history of your craft?
Yes, that's true. Let me just add a little plug here. My book, Uniquely Human, was published within 2 weeks of Neurotribes. Since that time, 4.5 years ago.
Wow. So you were right. Okay.
Since that time, Steve Silberman and I have become good friends.
I
He
bet.
lives in San Francisco, and I live on Rhode Island, in Rhode Island. A few major reviews, Nature magazine, and then one wonderful review by an autistic self-advocate, Judy Endow, who has a great blog. She wrote a review called Uniquely Human Neurotribes. And so our books have become they're seen almost as companion volumes. And what Steve says is, I give the history of autism up to the present to kind of advocate for a different way of viewing autism. Mm. What you do in Uniquely Human is kind of on the ground. How do we actually do that?
I wondered about that when I was looking through your resource list, and I forget what it was called, your guide to resources, because Neurotribes is not in that. And I wondered why it wasn't, but I didn't realize that they were published within weeks of each other.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And it's not on the resource list for the CERTS model, and it wasn't on the resource list for Uniquely Human for the reason you just mentioned. But Steve and I both read each other's books within a month before each was published. We each got pre-publication copies of that.
That's awesome.
No, Steve and I, right away, it's almost like in a very strange way, we became soulmates, because the themes and the respect for autistic people and the contributions of autistic people are threads throughout each of the books.
Can you see the comments in our studio?
It's funny, I was, and then it keeps switching off to private chat. Now I can, yes.
Okay, I was just saying, there's people are commenting as we're talking.
Yes.
And I didn't know if you could see that, because people are just loving your book. Somebody said, how do we get the resources? So in Dr. Prizant's book, Uniquely Human, there's a ton of resources in the back that he lists. And then for CERTS, he says you can go to certs.com, which is
actually we're updating the website now. Mm-hmm. If you want to get an updated PDF of the 4-page CERTS resource list, just shoot me an email. Very easy. It's my first initial and last name, Prizant, at gmail.com. Just put in the subject line, CERTS resource list, and I'll turn around and
awesome.
Get it out to you. Okay.
Oh, good. Somebody hasn't started the book yet. Yeah, it's a great book. Oh, and guys, if you're in the book club right now, the way this works on StreamYard is I can't see who's commenting. It just shows Facebook user.
By the way, somebody just
actually it's SCERTS.com. So put an S at the beginning of that.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. It won't let me see who's commenting, and I'm not good at multitasking. Excuse me, all of my kids are sick right now, and they think they've gotten me a little bit sick.
It's that time of year. Yes, it is.
Oh my gosh.
By the way, one thing I should point out to your audience, just in case they work with or reach people who speak different languages, Uniquely Human is now translated into 17 languages. And the CERTS model manuals are translated, besides English, of course, are translated into Korean, Japanese, and we're now working on Spanish translation as well, and will be translated into Italian.
Oh, wow. That is amazing. That is amazing. Oh, somebody said, please repeat your email address. And guys, I can put in the comments later on after the live is done, I'll put a few of the links that he's giving right now and I can add them.
Oh, that would be great. Yes.
I can do that.
Good.
Yeah, that's right. CERTS. That's right.
Right. Yep.
Let's see. Is that you?
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay. I hear a ding.
That could have been an email coming in my background.
Oh, okay. So I had one question. What's one piece of advice that you would give? A lot of the book clubbers are new parents and they have young children, or are teachers with young children, and they don't have any training. What's one piece of advice that you would give them besides reading Uniquely Human?
Yes.
What is one piece of advice you'd give them?
Well, I wish I had that question ahead of time. Let me tell you why. My publisher, Simon & Schuster, asked me to make some short videotapes when the book just came out. So I have a videotape that's called 5 Tips for Parents Following an Autism Diagnosis.
Oh, wow.
I have another, they're short, they're 3 or 4 minutes each. And then I have another videotape that is called 5 Tips for Educators. So if you go on the Amazon page for Uniquely Human, you will see those links to those videotapes on the Amazon page for Uniquely Human.
Okay.
Let me give you some tips. So for parents, new diagnosis, I think one of the most important tips is to understand that there is no ceiling on development, that your child has great potential, and it's up to us to provide the right supports to help your child have a happy life and really reach that potential. And one of the other tips I say is get your child out into the world. The kids I find, and I'm not saying it's not going to be challenging, but if we put the right supports into place, I will tell you, because I have followed some kids I knew as preschoolers for 30 years now. And the individuals who seem to have the best quality of life and who can deal with some of the challenges, despite some of the challenges of autism, because autism poses challenges, are the ones who have a lot of different experiences out in the real world. The kids who, and I understand why this happens, but the kids who are cloistered at home, and parents feel that that's their strategy for helping the family and helping the child, they don't have those experiences that they could learn from.
Right.
So I think that is very, very important as well. And the tips for teachers has to do with understanding that autistic children and individuals have a very different learning style, and that we need to teach in multiple ways, through movement, through visuals, not just speaking to kids. Most good teachers know that anyway. But the other piece I always mention is always see your classroom and your school as a community. And we want all children to feel that they're respected members who are included in the community with all of the children.
Valued.
Totally. That's exactly the right word, that they are valued. And that means educating the whole school community, educating kids in the classroom when necessary if a child's behavior is so different that it's confusing to the other children. That we all have to model that as adults, but sometimes we have to teach that directly.
I love that. Yeah. I do. I love that. That made me think. I have a blog myself, and the experiences thing, like giving your kids experiences, because when the kids do go to school and they're learning about a parade, let's say they're reading a book about a parade, but if they've never seen a parade, they don't have that prior knowledge to support their learning.
Absolutely.
I talked about that on one of my articles about doing things differently over the holidays. Don't sit out completely from the activities, just find a different way to do them. So like if we're going to see a parade, my kids don't do well with a lot of chaos. So we go up on a balcony somewhere. We rent a hotel room in our area that's above the parade so they can see it, but they don't have to hear it, or, you know, they don't have to feel the cold. And so just finding different ways to get out and experience those.
Yes. And you're actually pointing out some very important parts of the CERTS model, that we believe we have this concept that we call authentic progress. I mean, is progress a child being able to label 20 picture cards seated in a classroom,
Right,
abstract concepts or things they may never experience? Or is progress what we and other people in the field call active engagement? And by the way, what you did for your kids, if that is how they can best learn because they're well regulated emotionally and they're not feeling overwhelmed by the noise and the busyness and the movement, if they're watching and interested, that's active engagement.
right, right.
So the important piece here is, well, let me just get back to CERTS. We are what we call an activity-based model, that we want kids learning by being actively engaged in meaningful activities in their lives, not being pulled into discrete trial training with repetitive practice in labeling and pointing to and touch your nose and touch your ears, when there's no research that indicates that leads to authentic progress. So, yep.
Right. Okay, I have one more question for you. I know that I told you it was only going to be 30 minutes, and now we're at 40 minutes. Yeah. But I do have one more question, because I know this came up before we started your book. We read the introduction, and a lot of the autistic people in the group were concerned, and I was concerned as well about your choice for using person. I know you, I know you've heard this a bajillion times.
I was going to say, can I read your mind and tell you what you're about to say?
Yes, but and I did, and I read your author's note, but I still didn't completely understand why you chose to use person first language, and especially now that you said that you and Steve Silberman had copies of each other's books, and he definitely used identity. Is it identity first, or
identity first? Yes.
Yeah. So he used that, and then you chose to go a different route. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that for us?
Yeah, sure. First of all, please understand, and that, I mean, even though you did say Steve in his book used identity first language, the book's been out 4.5 years. A lot of the writing was 6-7 years ago.
Gotcha.
Okay, that's number one. Number two is, I do not agree that it is a black and white issue, that all autistic people. As a matter of fact, the one really negative comment on Amazon out of close to 300 comments came from an autistic woman. And I'll just be quite upfront, and you could read it, it's there. She said, I couldn't get past the introduction. This book is a piece of crap. I will not read anything else because you use person first language. Okay.
I think I know who that person might be.
Okay. And my friend Michael John Carley, who is a major, highly published self-advocate in the field of autism, came to my defense. And what he basically said was, I understand your concern about this, but we have bigger fish to fry. And why don't you get past that and look at the message? Okay, one more point. Last weekend, 2 weekends ago, I was attending the AANE conference in New England, Autism and Asperger's of New England Association, very progressive. At least half the people there were self-advocates. In one of the sessions I was seated in the audience, the question was raised, what do you think about identity first versus person first language? I will tell you honestly that about 60% of the people on the spectrum who responded say no, they definitely prefer identity first language. About 40% of the people said, well, person first language is okay with them, but they don't see it as such a hot issue.
Right.
So when somebody says every single person with autism, so what I do now, let me just tell you what I do now. I go back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I will use autistic child, autistic adult. And let me tell you one other point. I realize we're going a little bit late in time, but I'm in the process of going through a lot of my old articles because I put all my articles as free downloads on my website, and there are some that are not there. Guess what I used in my master's thesis in 1975 and my doctoral dissertation in 1978?
Identity first.
Identity first language. It was all autistic children, autistic adults. Why did I switch? Because the field thought, especially parents, thought that it is more respectful to look at the child or the adult first. Now, I fully understand how some adults with autism, many adults with autism, say if you say with autism, it's like a disease. I don't carry around my autism in a bag. It is who I am. Okay. And I'm very,
I get that.
And I'm pretty good friends with Temple Grandin. I've known Temple for years. And Temple was one of the first to say, if you take away my autism, you take away who I am. But she doesn't really dig in on any strong opinion about identity first versus person first. If you see her present, she'll say people with autism, and then she'll say autistic people. So I understand why it's an emotional issue, an important issue for many autistic adults, but I don't think it's the hot button issue that some people make it out to be. And when I speak to people on the spectrum I work with, they say, Stephen Shore, Temple, Michael John Carley, they say, yeah, I mean, it's an important issue to some people, but it isn't, you should stand or fall as being respected based upon the language you use.
Thank you for that.
So, yeah.
I didn't want to put you in the hot seat, but I did want to ask, just because we did have a response from some of our autistic book club members. So I wanted to ask, just out of respect for them.
Yeah.
And I was curious as well. When I read the author's note, I was like, oh man, I don't know if this was a good decision, if we should, because I didn't know anything about the book before we picked it. It was just in the recommendations. Yeah. So I was like, oh man, I just don't know if I made the right decision. And then as soon as I read the introduction, I mean, I told you I had chills. The book is so amazing. The content is so amazing. Yeah. And I don't even hear person first language in there. It's like not even, it's like a non-issue when you're reading such quality content that you want to scream from every mountaintop.
And also I think that there's one other issue related to this. You can't infer a person's intentions. And the one autistic woman who commented on Amazon saying, it's obvious you have no respect for autistic people. I didn't see it as an issue of respect. I just saw it as, wait a second, I used to use identity first language and I switched because the field switched. And now I fully respect people who say, Barry, please don't call me a person with autism. Please call me an autistic person. I'll say, I respect that, and I will do what you're asking me to do. Right. No problem. I have no problem with that.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't think people should be demonized without knowing their intention or where things stand historically.
Well, I think that my hesitation was because this is my book club, and it's learning about autism, but I'm not autistic. So right. I feel like I'm in kind of, I want to be the most respectful I can be to our autistic book club members, and the fact that I'm not autistic kind of, I need to tread much more carefully and watch what content that we're talking about. So I think that was just a big issue for me, to make sure that I was respectful of them. But I mean, the book is, if you read past the author's note, it's like the whole issue washes away almost.
Well, one other quick point, and that is, do we learn, do we evolve, and do we change? So I've actually started doing some writing for what might be my next book, and guess what? I'm using identity first language.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have anything else you want to talk about, or?
Not really. And there are some great questions that people posed. There actually was a parent who has attended our retreat, and she posed a question about how do you, as a parent, what do I recommend in terms of how do you speak to people, other parents whose goal primarily is to cure their child and who really see autism as this absolutely awful thing that's happened to them and to their family. And what I say is pretty much what I say up front, and that is, if we're going to be a resource, if we're going to be of help, we have to be compassionate, but we also have to say what we feel we believe.
Speak your truth.
Absolutely. Speak the truth. Don't try to convince them otherwise, but let them know there is another way. And so, I talk about in my talks on Uniquely Human, I actually gave this talk at the United Nations a few years ago at Autism Awareness Day, that autism is not a tragedy. And if we see it just as a tragedy, we're going to have problems emotionally, in supporting our child and the approaches we take. But there can be tragic consequences if a child with autism has a lot of associated biomedical conditions, or adults have mental health issues, or if society doesn't provide the right supports. So there can be difficulties that some people view as tragic, but autism in and of itself is not a tragedy. There are many happy autistic people. And what I've learned in more recent years, I've met many married autistic people who have children and who want to raise an autistic child. So how can you view that as a tragedy if people experiencing autism are not leading tragic lives, if you will?
And the rebuttal to that is always, well, you don't know how severe my child is, or you don't know the issues that my child is having, as if you're out of touch. You're telling me all this, but you're out of touch. You don't know what's happening.
And I respect that, but one of the things autistic self-advocates are saying is what is most challenging to them is not simply just the autism. It might be severe gastrointestinal issues. Okay. It might be the sensory world that is imposing upon them. Of course, the sensory issues are a part of autism, but are we making the changes? Are we showing sensory friendly films? And by the way, society is beginning to catch up.
They are.
With all of this. So the point is, it's a lot of other issues that may not be the autism per se. And then again, let's switch back and talk about what are, and it's become almost like a cliche, but what are some of the superpowers that autism gives you? Whether it's very, very good visual spatial skills and excellent memory, what might it be? And I think one other point, a dear friend of mine, Becca Laurie, who's on the spectrum, who I just met a few years ago, she gave a phenomenal keynote address at the Autism Asperger's of New England conference. And it was about what is quality of life for an autistic person. And she said, quality of life for me is very different than what it is for a lot of neurotypicals. So she got married recently to a wonderful man, and she showed a slide of this crazy wedding with everybody dancing. And obviously from the picture, it was noisy and it was insane. She goes, that's not what I see as a wonderful wedding. And then she showed a slide of herself with her husband, Antonio, taking a walk out in the woods with nobody else around. So I think we have to not impose neurotypical views of what a good quality of life is and continue to learn from people on the spectrum.
That's so true.
Yeah.
I always tell people my favorite learning group is Autism Inclusivity, and that's run by Emma Delmain. I think she's in England. I'm pretty sure. But she runs AIM, Autistic Inclusive Meets in England, and she does a lot of things as a self-advocate. But yeah, learning from autistics, it has changed pretty much everything that I do with my kids and how I think about things. And you're definitely spot on with that. I want to read just one little line that you wrote in your introduction. And it said, even under extremely challenging circumstances, our attitudes about and perspective of people with autism and their behavior make a critical difference in their lives and in ours. Just the perspective of, is it a tragedy, or is it just different, or is it enchanting, or I think you said replacing fear with awe and love. And I now I see my autistic kids in learning from them as kind of walking through an enchanted forest, because they learn things so much differently, they interact so much differently than I do, and learning from them has been enchanting, really. It
Yes.
has.
And you have to be in the right place emotionally for us to sit back and say, okay, now wait a second. I'm going to really try to see the way my child or my friend sees the world. And it's a very different way of seeing the world, but it opens up my mind to the fact that the world can be experienced and people can be experienced in very, very different ways.
That's also, there's a comment. This is Louisa. Hey, Louisa. She's one of my moderators. In case you can't, okay. Yeah, you have been saying that that's what we need to stop imposing neurotypical views of play on kids and what are fun activities, right? Yeah, exactly, Louisa.
Yes.
That's exactly right. Because most children, they want to play dodgeball, or they want to play I don't know, tag or something, but that may not be what they want to do, what autistic children want to do. And then us imposing that on them, and then that sets them up for failure when that's not what they wanted to do in the first place.
That's right. If I could just follow up quickly, because I just saw an interview on CNN between Anderson Cooper and Malcolm Gladwell, who's written those amazing books, David and Goliath, and so many other books. And they both said they were introverts. Okay. And then they were saying, well, how could we be introverts? We're on TV, we give talks to all these people. Then they said something that resonated so much about autism, and I can relate to it because I think of myself as an introvert. Okay.
So,
And the difference that they said was extroverts, and I see this in my wife, she's really an extrovert. Their brains are structured in a way that they get energized by chatting with people and talking with people and hanging out with people and being at noisy, busy parties. And it's almost like fireworks go off in their brain. They get high from that. Okay.
mm-hmm.
Introverts, it doesn't mean that we don't want to be with people.
We
It
don't
doesn't
enjoy
mean that we don't enjoy that at times. It means that it sometimes exhausts us, that sometimes we don't have enough gas in our tank.
We have to recover from it, right?
Exactly. We have to give ourselves time. We have to give ourselves breaks. We have to recover from how taxing it is to be social all the time. And I learned very early on, this is a woman who I talk about in my book, Roz Blackburn from England, and Uniquely Human. When I traveled with her and presented with her, we would always say, and she always traveled with another woman who was a companion who helped her. I would say, Roz, do you want to go out to a restaurant tonight? She goes, no, I'm not in the mood to do social. And I use that phrase now. I don't want to do social tonight. And it's because
I love that.
somehow it's refueling to have time by ourselves.
Yeah.
And here are two very famous people not on the spectrum talking about that's what it means to be an introvert. That you don't get high by being exposed to people all the time in social situations. And that helps me. And that helps me in my marriage, actually, because my wife loves to go out and do things and connect with people all the time. I say, no, I'll stay home tonight. No, thank you.
What is the book that I bet you know what it's called? It's where you figure out what type of personality you have, where like INFJ or E.
Oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, but it's escaping me right now.
It's escaping me too, but that explains a lot about being an introvert / extrovert, and talking about how the extroverts get energy from socializing, like you were talking about fireworks in the brain, and then introverts, not that they don't want to talk to people, but it just sucks the life right out of them. It just drains the battery.
That's right.
I can't remember what that book is called for the life of me.
Yeah.
It's been on my bookshelf since I was probably really young.
Yeah. And, I've always had, at least autistic people and now autistic friends, they always say to me, Barry, you're very easy to be around. You don't stress people out. And it's because I'm kind of a introverted person. And I think, I'm not on the spectrum, but I think there's a little bit of me that could understand the need to step back,
Yeah.
the need to look at a social situation, say, I'm not so sure I'm going to get a lot of pleasure out of this right now. I think, as a matter of fact, it might be challenging right now. So I actually don't like the phrase, there's a little bit of autism in all of us, but I
Right.
think of it as a continuum.
You're able to empathize with them. You're able to say, I understand you can't do social right now. I understand. I definitely understand that.
That's right.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's see. I think that's it. Are there any other comments that you saw that you wanted to respond to?
Oh, let's see. I mean, there's so many more here that I want to dive in, but that'll keep us
I
going.
love that everybody's kind of tuning in today. Thanks for coming and hanging with us. He talked about Asha earlier in the video. I can't see who wrote this comment.
I'm looking at that right now about, do I have a position on if Asha is moving more towards behavior? We discussed that earlier.
We discussed that earlier in the video. The video will post, and then you can review the beginning part later after it posts.
Okay.
And I'm talking just to the person who commented on that. And then I'm also once it posts, I'll put some comments up and with the links for CERTS and with Dr. Prizant's email address if you wanted to get some resources maybe for your school system. And
also, if I could just add, on my website, which is just my name, so it's www.barryprizant.com.
Right.
If you go to resources and downloads, there are quite a few articles I've published over the years. Some of them are technical. Some of them are not at all. I wrote a column for Autism Spectrum Quarterly for 5 years. 3-4-page articles. There are 30 of them posted.
Oh, wow.
And many of them touch upon the issues that we're talking about right now. All free downloads. Awesome. And I'm going to be adding some more over the next week or so. Yeah.
And I'll post that link in case y'all don't know how to spell his name, but I'll post that link as well in the comments. And I appreciate you joining us, and I appreciate you joining the group. And if you'd like to join in the discussions anytime, I know Steve Silverman, he joined in the discussions when we were talking about his book, and that was pretty awesome. So, I mean, I know you're a busy guy, so you're probably not on Facebook a lot, but if you want to pop in from time to time, you can. We'll be on your book for, gosh, we are so slow. We move so slowly in our book club, just because we're all pretty much, we all have families, we're all working, so we're not in a rush. We just want to get the information, but we want to move pretty slowly.
Well, let me give you a quote, okay, from Roz Blackburn, who I talk about in Uniquely Human. She says, there's one thing you could do to help every autistic person on earth tomorrow. One thing we could do. And I think that goes not just for autistic people. She said, slow down the pace of life by 50%.
Well, that is our motto in this group. So I think we're doing something right.
Yeah.
I agree with that, especially when we're talking about early childhood, how kindergarten is just so developmentally inappropriate across the board. I mean, they're doing second grade work, and there's this big rush in early childhood of, oh, does your kid know their letters? Does your kid do this? Does your kid do that? By the time they're 5, what are we rushing for? It's not like they get any smarter when they're 18.
Yeah.
It's not like you have this big jump when they get 18. It doesn't matter if they knew this at 3 or at 5 or at 7.
Yeah.
It's not, what is the rush?
It's so true. I mean, if we want to make an autism-friendly world, and which, as happens so often, when we do things to help autistic people, it helps all the children.
Best practices for autism are best practices across the board.
Absolutely. And slowing things down is one good way to do that. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And it's been my pleasure to have you in the book club. And hopefully we will talk soon or whenever.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.